all had an amazing week up to this point. I hope it continues to get better as we share this time together. So I'm Tom, and we are a student club called ASOC. So we are Adventist students on campus. We run events kind of like this semi-regularly. Every Friday and Saturday night, we usually have either small groups or we combine as a big group, and we share and delve into the Word together in ES 204, which is just across the hallway. So if you like what you've heard this evening, or you want to learn more, or you're just curious about who we are, I want to invite you to come along to those events as well. We would love to have you along to them.
Not tomorrow night,
Yes, not tomorrow night. Tomorrow we'll be in a different room, SRG 09, which is on the other side of campus, due to difficulties with the water system in this building. But yeah, for tonight, in terms of announcements, we have toilets which are just down this hallway here to your left, and there's a door near the kitchen. Once you go through that door, the women's toilet is directly on your right, and the men's toilet is down the hallway a little bit further. But that's where you should find toilets. We also have some drinks that we can share this evening, just some juice and stuff if you would like to stay along for that as well. Have some refreshments afterwards. After the talk this evening, we're going to have a Q&A session as well. So if you have any questions that arise through the talk, if you would like to hold on to them or write them down, and at the end, we'll have an opportunity for you to find answers to those questions. So I hope you have an amazing evening. I'd like to invite Christopher up the front today. He'll be our speaker. To ask him some questions. Well, thank you, Chris. Thanks for coming and joining us this evening.
No problem. Thank you for having me.
I'd like to ask you as a first question, so where are you from and what do you do for work?
Sure. So I'm living in Singleton these days, which is about an hour away from Newcastle here. And at the moment, I'm working as a church pastor there in Singleton and in Muswellbrook as well.
Thank you very much. So a follow-up question to that. What made you want to become a pastor?
Sure. So I grew up in a Christian kind of home, and kind of like everyone has to do when you get to those teenage years, you have to start working and figuring out your faith for yourself. And I was kind of already doing that, but I had a friend at school, and me and him, we would just talk about topics like what we're talking about tonight and in this series just all the time. We happened to catch the same bus together, so we would get on the bus and we would just talk about this for an hour until we got to school, and then we'd finish school, get on the bus, talk about it for another hour. On weekends, we'd call each other, and it was just this constant back and forth between me and this friend of mine. And every time we had these conversations and, he could kind of learn something new or understand something about God or about the Bible, it just made me realize, okay, this is what I want to do for the rest of my life. Just talk people through this, take them on that journey of discovering about God. And I think you can't beat it. You'll see these moments where people are thinking, they're hearing what you're saying, and like something just goes on behind their eyes and you realize they got it. They understand it. And you just can't beat that experience. And so I just, it was something I put up to prayer and said, God, I want to spend the rest of my life doing this. And I thought God say, yep, go ahead, do it. And here I am, still doing it. So, yeah.
Oh, thank you very much for sharing. And our final question is, what has been a blessing from your week so far?
Sure. I think a blessing from this week, I know it probably sounds a bit cliche, but really it's just being here. Yesterday and tonight, it's just been, incredible hearing feedback from people, hearing the questions that have been coming in, and just getting to meet so many different people. So I know that does sound a bit cliche, but honestly, it probably is, the biggest highlight, biggest blessing for me from this past week.
Oh, thank you very much for sharing. I'll hand it over to you, and I hope you all enjoy.
No worries, thanks Tom. Well, we're just going to get right into it. This is now session 3 of our series on, is there evidence for God? That's the big question that we're trying to answer together. And so far, we've looked at a whole variety of different types of evidences. We've looked at evidences from logic, from morality, from scientific observations, We've made all of these different arguments and evidences so far. And as we've kind of pieced together this case that there's really good evidence for God to exist, we've also been learning bits and pieces, details about who God is. So some of them would be that God is immaterial, timeless, he's spaceless, personal, powerful. He's ultimately morally good. He cares for human life. He's orderly, he's rational. Now, if you have missed the first few presentations so far and you're interested in learning more about this, we are recording these at the back there, so they're all being live streamed and you can watch those back later. And just while I'm on that, can I get you to raise your hand if this is your first time here tonight? Anyone here for the first time? We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 or 10 or so. Okay, awesome. Thank you so much for being here. I've said this on earlier nights as well, but I really commend the time that you're giving to be here tonight. You want to search out these questions. It shows to me you being here, you're open to that and respect that. But now I want to get a bit deeper. This is what we've learned about what God is like so far, but this is not shallow. It's quite a lot to go off, but we're not really getting into the deeper part of this. This is a description of what God is like kind of over there. But we want to know, what is God like right here when it comes to our personal day-to-day life? What does it mean for God to actually exist? And this is where we need to go beyond the arguments that we've looked at so far and look at what claims to be a revelation from God. This is the Bible. The Bible makes this incredible claim that it is a communication from God to us, that God, through human authors and writers, is speaking to us. And by doing that, he's revealing more about himself, his character, who he is, what he is like. So the question is, though, can the Bible actually substantiate this claim, right? It claims it has divine origin. It claims that it comes from God. Is it able to actually back that up? Anything can make that claim. Can the Bible actually prove it? Now, the next two presentations, we're going to really get into that question. But tonight, we're actually going to take just a little bit of a detour from our session so far. So far, we've been looking at evidences for God. Today, because our next two evidences will be evidences from the Bible, I first want to take just a short detour tonight and ask the question, is the Bible a reliable and trustworthy document? Is it a reliable source of information? Because if it's not, why would we be convinced by supposed evidences from it? Do you catch what I'm saying? Before we look at evidences of God from the Bible, let's just take a step back and say, well, is the Bible even reliable and trustworthy? Should we even be taking the time to study and look at what it has to say? And so that's what we're going to get into tonight, looking at this topic of, is the Bible reliable? Now, to do this, we're going to do a bit of myth busting tonight. Because a lot of people, when they hear the words, the Bible, when they hear about the Bible, they come with preconceived ideas. And I guarantee every single one of us here tonight has preconceptions or assumptions about the Bible. But a lot of these ideas or assumptions we have are not really true. They're myths. And so tonight I want to go through some of the most common myths that we have about the Bible, get rid of them so that we can say, you know what, the Bible at the very least is a reliable document. Now let's see if it really is from God. So that's what we're going to get into tonight. And before we continue, I'm just going to say a short prayer. Dear God, I just thank you for this time to be here tonight. Thank you for giving safe travels to everyone to come here. And Lord, I just pray that you help me to speak the right words now. I pray in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, let's get into the myths. Myth number one is this. The text of the Bible has been radically edited and changed over history, and its original meaning has been lost. Can I get you to raise your hand? Anyone heard this objection about the Bible before? You can't trust the Bible because it's been changed and edited and mixed around so many times, no one knows what it actually used to say originally. Well, ultimately, this is a question of manuscripts. So with any type of ancient document, really any document, It comes down to, if you want to know what the copy you have, how close it is to the original, you compare as many copies as possible, right? And the more copies of a document you have, the more certain you can be that what you have is really close to the original document. Now, let's have a look at some ancient documents aside from the Bible to get a bit of a picture first. So we're going to focus on the New Testament writings and other ancient documents from that time period. So let's take, for example, the works of Plato. Plato is a very famous Greek philosopher. Would anyone like to guess how many copies we have from the works of Plato? So Plato's an ancient philosopher. Anyone brave enough to put up their hand, give a guess, how many copies do you think we have of his writings? This is one of the most famous philosophers in the world. All right, we've got a guess of 10. Over here? 15. Any other guesses?
None.
None. We got more than none, but it's a good guess.
50.
50, okay. We got anyone higher than 50? Anyone, go on.
This is older than a certain number of years, surely, because I mean, now it'll be infinite, like millions of copies.
So now we have dozens of copies. So what we're asking for is ancient copies of these manuscripts. How many ancient copies do we have? The answer is we only have 7 ancient copies of the works of Plato. Now here's what's even more mind-boggling, right? The way that you can also determine how close a copy is to the original is the gap of time between the two, right? The longer the time, the more skeptical you'd be. The shorter the time between the copy and the original, the more reliable it would be. When it comes to the works of Plato, we have a gap of 1,200 years between the original and the earliest copy that we have, and we've only got 7 copies. Now, historians are very, very confident that the records we have of Plato are reliable, but when you look at what they have to go off, it's not a lot, right? Let's have a look at some other documents. We come to, for example, a Roman historian, Herodotus. We have only 8 copies of his writings, and the earliest copy is 1,300 years after Herodotus originally wrote. When it comes to the works of Caesar, we've only got 10 copies and another 1,000-year gap. Now, on the higher end of the spectrum, there's 193 copies of the works of Sophocles. That's getting a bit more, right? We're getting a bit more confidence now with 193. But it's still a huge gap of time. The earliest copy is 1,400 years after Sophocles originally wrote his work. Probably the best contender is Homer's Iliad. Most of us are probably familiar with the Iliad. There's 643 copies of this document. So that's actually really quite good. And this time it has a smaller gap of only about 500 years. That's probably, in terms of the documents we're looking at so far, probably as good as it gets. But as you can see, historians really have to have a lot of confidence that these very few copies, in the case of things like Caesar's Gallic Wars and Plato's writings, these copies that are so late are actually reflecting what is true. But they're confident that they are. So now let's apply the same standard to the writings of the New Testament. So these are books that were written between the 50s to around 70, 80s AD, right? How many copies of the New Testament would we have? Now keep in mind, we've got 600 roundabout of Homer's Iliad. Is anyone willing to guess how many copies of the New Testament we might have? Anyone feeling brave?
Thousands.
Thousands. You want to give us a guess in there?
I've heard it before.
Okay. I appreciate the honesty. 5,600 copies. Now this just completely blows out of the water any other ancient historical document. There are 5,600 copies of the New Testament manuscripts. And as for the gap of time, it's not 1,000, it's not 500 years. The earliest copy we have of, a copy of the New Testament is just 100 years after the original. Now again, in terms of historical documents, this is unheard of. For it to have a copy so close to the original, to have it only be a margin of 100 years. Now what's even crazier is, that's just manuscripts written in Greek. If you were to include ancient documents written in Syrian, Latin, Coptic, and Aramaic, that adds another 19,000 copies. So all up across 5 different languages, we have over 24,000 of these documents from the New Testament. Now again, historians agree, the writings of Plato, the writings of Sophocles and Caesar, we know with certainty that what they wrote is real. So when it comes to the writings of the New Testament, we know for even more certain that the copies we have they match the originals that we have. In fact, it's estimated that the New Testament has been copied with 99.5% accuracy from the original. Now that is just an incredible percentage. Now what about that 0.5%? The atheist scholar Bart Ehrman has this to say about this 0.5%. He goes, most of the change found in early Christian manuscripts have nothing to do with theology or ideology. Far and away, the most changes are the result of mistakes, pure and simple slip-ups of the pen, accidental omissions, inadvertent additions, misspelled words, blunders of one sort or another. In other words, what he's saying is the manuscript evidence shows us in no way has the Bible been edited and changed to such a degree that it's unrecognizable. The only discrepancies we have are basically typos, spelling mistakes, grammar mistakes, things that are really easy to account for. I'm going to give you an example of what it would be like to take copies of a manuscript and find the original meaning. Let's have a look at this. Let's say manuscript 1 says, take up his cross and follow me. What's wrong with this one so far? We got a spelling error, right? That's pretty easy. Manuscript 2 says, take up his cross and follow me. That looks okay so far. Manuscript 3 says, pick up his cross and follow me. Now, why do you think someone would say pick up instead of take up? Probably, we all hear sayings and phrases, and sometimes we just kind of misremember them. And if you were writing down a phrase that you thought you knew well, you probably wouldn't check, right? You just go, I know this one, take up, follow, pick up. So that would be just one of those kinds of mistakes you'd make. And manuscript 4, take up his cross and follow me. Okay. Now, if we want to say, okay, what did the original say? It's pretty easy, right? We go, well, obviously cross at the top is a typo, so it should be with a C, because every other manuscript has a C. Fallow can't be right, because every other manuscript has O, not an A there. And all the other 3 manuscripts say take up, not pick up, so the proper reading would be take up his cross and follow me. It's a pretty intuitive, process.
I just want to say, as a linguist, the meaning hasn't changed, just saying.
That's correct, and that's what's important, right? The meaning of the text has not in any way changed. You can have a spelling error, a typo, a grammar error, and the meaning is still within the text. So basically, this myth is pretty much busted. There is not any manuscript evidence that shows that from the time that the New Testament in particular was written to what we have today, there's been this corruption and editing process that makes the Bible unreliable. Let's go to the second myth. Myth number 2 is the following. The Bible was compiled by a secretive and nefarious council of political and religious leaders to promote certain doctrines and suppress others that didn't fit their narrative. I know that's a bit of a mouthful, but again, has anyone heard this one before? The Bible, it was put together by the secret council. This was popularized by the fictional novel The Da Vinci Code by Dan Brown. And basically, ever since Dan Brown published it, no one can stop talking about this idea that, the church came together in one day, they got all the most powerful people in town, they picked the books that went in the Bible, and the books that they didn't like, they threw away. All right, this is a historical claim. Is there any actual truth to this statement? Ultimately, this is a question of what we call canon. Now, when I say canon, I'm not talking about something you fire cannonballs from a pirate ship. A canon refers to a recognized authoritative standard. So let me give you a bit of a silly example. I had a friend who, when Star Wars Episode 7 came out, was very upset. And I said, why are you upset that Star Wars Episode 7's out? And he said, well, you know, after the original trilogy, they printed all these books about what Luke and Leia and Han Solo were up to after they defeated the Empire and all this, right? And he said, and the books were canon. In other words, the books were authoritative. If you wanted to continue reading about Star Wars, you could read the books. They were authoritative. But he said, now that they're making Episode 7, the books are no longer considered canon. The books are non-authoritative. Now the movies are replacing the books. Now, I know that's a very trivial example, but I hope it gets across what I mean. When we're talking about documents or even media like books or movies, there's something you call canon. What is the authorized, recognized standard? And this becomes not a trivial thing like about Star Wars. This becomes a really important matter when you're talking about religious beliefs and systems. And so the church, they had to come up with, what do we recognize is canon? We have all of these books and writings available to us. What do we recognize as being authoritative and the standard by which we test our beliefs and our practice and our doctrines? Well, far from being this nefarious plot, the history is actually quite enlightening. The first thing that the early Christians did was they got what was already accepted as canon by the Jewish people. The Jews for centuries had been collecting books that they believed were inspired and written by prophets led by God. And so these Jews, they collected them, and for them, this was their canon. They said, these are the authoritative books of our religion. Now, when the Christians came along, they simply saw themselves as a continuation of the Jewish faith. And so they said, well, we'll accept the Jewish canon. In fact, if you read the historian Josephus, he says that by the time of the 400s BC, the Jews had closed their canon, they decided what it was, and no books were added from the 400s BC until the time of the early Christian church. So it was really confirmed and solid by that point. In fact, Stephen B. Chapman, an associate professor of Old Testament studies, puts it this way. He says, by the turn of the millennium, a Jewish canon of scripture was largely in place, if not absolutely defined and delimited in scope. In other words, the Christians really didn't reinvent the wheel here. They said, look, the Jews have recognized these books as authoritative. We see ourselves as a continuation of this faith, and so we'll just accept the books that have been passed down to us. But then the Christians also had some new decisions to make, because they were anticipating that just as God had spoken through prophets in the old times with the Jews, he would similarly do so in their present day. They could see Jesus, for them, was this Messiah figure. He was this all-important character that God had sent to the world. They could see God is starting something new here. This is a new movement. And so they anticipated, God is going to send us more writings. He's going to give us direction and guidance for our journey. And so the Christians had to come up with some tests, because there's all these books and writings around them. How were they going to discover what the canon was? Now, this is important to recognize that the church did not see themselves as determining the canon. They saw themselves as discovering it. Because it wasn't a matter of picking and choosing what they liked. They were only going to decide on books that they believed God himself had inspired. In other words, this wasn't a human choice. It was humans discovering what God had already chosen. Another good way of putting it is, some say, the canon is not an authoritative list of books, but a list of authoritative books. I'll say it again. The canon is not an authoritative list of books, but a list of authoritative books. So what were these tests that the early Christian used to discover which books has God inspired? They ultimately had about 5 tests that they would go through. I think if we maybe go back 1 or 2 slides. Maybe it's a bit later. There are 5 main theories, 5 main tests that they used. The first was it had to not conflict with the theology and doctrines of other inspired books. So if these books had already been established, if another book came and contradicted it, they said, no, that one can't be the real deal, because we already have an authoritative standard. Secondly, it had to have a known authorship from an apostle or an associate of apostle or a church leader. It had to be from someone that the church community knew, recognized, and respected. No Joe Blow could just write something down and say, I've got a new book for the Bible. It had to be someone that was widely recognized within the church community. The third test was it had to have a widespread acceptance and distribution among the Christian community. In other words, there had to be a wide recognition of churches independently saying, yes, we recognize that this is an inspired work. Fourthly, there had to be a central focus on Jesus, the message of salvation, and Christian living. If it wasn't about that, well, it's not really any point in it being in the Christian canon. And finally, they had this conviction that they had this belief that the Holy Spirit from God would convict the believers of what was true and what was false. Now, that is the more subjective of these tests, but those first 4 are very objective, we would say. So using these tests, we can see that there was a very gradual development over time as Christians in each generation across different parts of the world over time came to this consensus. Here's just, I'm going to go through a very quick timeline of what this process looked like. By the 90s and 100s ADs, the New Testament canon is already being gradually formed as Christians are using some texts in their worship and doctrine. By the time we get to the 100, 200 AD, the early church fathers, these are church leaders, they're affirming that books are authoritative by appealing to them in their works. So they're writing to other believers and saying, as it says in this book, you need to follow this. They refer to these books as being authoritative. By the 170 AD, you have what is probably the first example of a Christian writing a list of what he thinks is the biblical canon. Now, it's important to know, we're going to see quite a few of these. These church leaders aren't saying, I'm the leader, so therefore this is what the Bible canon is. They're saying, over time, in the place that I'm from, and in the generations that have come, this is what we as a community believe are the canonical books. And so you can see that there's a conversation being had among the Christians. By the 180 AD, the 4 Gospels had long been considered authoritative and the only historical accounts of Jesus' life. So they said there are only 4 reliable Gospels that recount the life of Jesus. Then you've got Origen writing another list. We keep going. And we see that by the late 200s, Eusebius writes a list, then Cyril, then Athanasius writes a list, including the 27 books that we have in our New Testament today. And finally, there are 2 councils that confirm the canon, but notice how late in history these are. These are in almost the 400s AD. And by this time, these councils, all they're doing is saying, well, we've basically agreed on this for a long time now. For basically over 100 years, our Christian church has decided communally together, this is what our canon is. We'll just meet together and rubber stamp it. That is the way that this is the process that the canon, the New Testament, was undertaken. Now, listen to this quote from the scholar Kurt Aland. He's a theologian and textual critic. He says, the canon was not imposed from the top, be it by bishops or synods, and then accepted by the community. So it's not a top-down decision. He says the organized church did not create the canon. It recognized that the canon had been created. Another theologian, F.F. Bruce, he puts it this way: one thing must be emphatically stated. The New Testament books did not become authoritative for the church because they were formally included in a canonical list. On the contrary, the church included them in her canon because she already regarded them as divinely inspired, recognizing their innate worth and general apostolic authority, direct or indirect. In other words, what he's saying is, again, this was a gradual, ongoing process of Christians recognizing these books are inspired. In no sense do we have any record in history of some secret council getting together and saying, we're going to make the rules of what is and isn't in the Bible. It's just an unhistorical fact. The development of the New Testament took place over hundreds of years. It was a communal activity of Christians across space and time. And so this myth is very much busted as well. But maybe you're still thinking, I'm still not sure, because I've heard about this idea that there are some books that are lost or missing from the Bible. Maybe did they still try to keep out some books because they didn't like them? Probably if you've heard of lost or missing books of the Bible, it's very nice clickbait, makes for good headlines and fiction novels. Probably what there's being referred to is the Nag Hammadi Library. This was a library of books discovered in 1945. And they're basically a collection of what are called Gnostic texts. The Gnostics were a religious group that arose in the 200s AD. And their theology was completely different from Christianity. They believed things like the material world, the physical world was evil. They believed that within each person there's like a divine spark that is God. Now this was completely opposed to Christianity. But the Gnostics wanted to use the person of Jesus to teach their doctrines. And so you find a lot of writings written between the 200s to 300s AD. They're written saying, I'm from the Apostle Peter, I'm from the Apostle Thomas, I'm from the Apostle whoever, and claiming to be this, but really they're all just forgeries and fakes because they were written in the 200s or 300s AD. Let's just play this out in our minds. Let's pretend we're a Christian in, say, the 300s AD. We're going and meeting in someone's home, getting ready for worship, and all of a sudden someone runs in with this scroll in their hand and they say, everyone, you won't believe it. I've got a gospel from the Apostle Thomas. And everyone goes, what? You got a gospel from Thomas? Yeah, I found it the other day and I'm ready to share it with everyone. The first thing you would think is, Thomas has been dead for 150 years. How on earth did you get a gospel from Thomas? And so you probably think, well, maybe we just kind of missed it. Maybe we were one of the churches who didn't get Thomas's gospel. So you send messages to other neighboring church communities and you ask, hey, has anyone heard of this gospel of Thomas? The messages come back and every single one of them says, we've never heard of a gospel of Thomas before. We've got Matthew, we know Mark, we all love Luke, we like John. We've never even heard of a gospel from Thomas before. And so now you're really getting suspicious because you're thinking, okay, no one has ever heard or seen this gospel before. Thomas has been dead for 150 years, but maybe you're just deadly curious. And so you open up the scroll to read what it says inside. Now, what I'm going to read for you are actual quotes from the Gospel of Thomas. It begins by saying, these are the secret sayings which the living Jesus spoke and which Didymus Judas recorded. Now already you'd probably be going, this doesn't make quite sense. Jesus didn't have these secretive, private conversations. He spoke openly with his disciples and with the crowd. So why is it recording secret sayings of Jesus that we've never heard before? Then you keep reading it. It says something like this. Jesus, he tells secret things to Thomas. And the disciples say, Thomas, tell us, what secret things did Jesus tell you? And Thomas tells them, if I tell you even one of the things Jesus told me, you will pick up stones and stone me, and the stones will set you on fire. And then you're probably thinking, what? I've never heard anything like this. Fire, stones putting people on fire. Then you get to the very end of the book. This is the actual last sentences of the book of Thomas. And here the Apostle Peter comes to Jesus, and he says, Jesus, let Mary leave us, for women are not even worthy of life. Okay, now, you're an early Christian, you read that, and you're thinking, I don't think this really checks out. I don't think Jesus ever said that. But wait, it gets better. Jesus replies to Peter by saying, I myself shall lead her in order to make her a male, so that she too may become a living spirit resembling you males. For every woman who will make herself a male will enter the kingdom of heaven. Okay, does anyone want to put the Gospel of Thomas in the Bible? It's clear why none of these books were even considered for the canon. And this is why I read out these real portions of it, to just show to you how clickbaity these ideas are. That, they kept out stuff they didn't like. Again, why was the Gospel of Thomas and these other books not put in? The apostles, like Thomas, had been dead for at least over 150 years. No church had ever heard of these things, and when they actually read the contents of the book, it was just rubbish, for lack of a better word, and did not match up with the doctrines that they had been taught. The Jesus that's recorded in the Gospels, you would never find say any of the crazy and insulting things that Jesus says in the Gospel of Thomas. So I just really want to lay to rest this idea that it was this nefarious plot. This is a very organic process of Christians recognizing what Jesus had and hadn't inspired. Look, we've got 3 more myths to go, but these are going to be all really quick. We're going to just pump through these ones. Myth number 3 is this. The Bible has been translated from a translation, and the original meaning is completely lost. Now, this is not to do with manuscripts, but the translation process. Probably one of the people who made this very popular was the comedian David Cross. He put it this way. He said, the Bible is literally the world's oldest game of telephone. And the reason he said that is, when you play telephone, you whisper it, someone mishears, and they pass it on, and the message is nothing like it started. And so he was saying, look, you can translate it from one language, translate it from, say, Greek into English, then English into Swahili, then Swahili into French, then French into German. By the time you get it in German, it doesn't match the Greek. That's the claim, right? This one's just really simple to answer. How many Greek manuscripts did I say at the beginning we have of the New Testament? Anyone remember? 5,600. Now, if I'm trying to translate the Bible, let's say, into Swahili or French or German or English, what do you think I'm going to use? The Greek manuscripts. I've got 5,600 of them to work with. No way I'm going to use a Swahili, French, German translation. I want to show you this photo. This is me and Sarvel on our wedding day. This was November the 15th of 2020. Now, this is a very happy day, but I'm going to show you another photo which is a very sad day. Let's go to the next photo. This is College Hall on the campus of Avondale University. This is sad. This is a sad photo because on November 16th, the day after my wedding, I had to go and sit my final Greek exam for my degree. And in that exam, I had to translate from the Greek into English. So if anyone can tell you how translation works, it's me. Trust me, I have a tragic backstory for translating from Greek into English. There's no way that we go from Greek, English, Swahili, French to get a German translation. We just go straight from the Greek into the following language. So this myth, easily busted. Myth number 4, the Bible is an inaccurate record of history. This is often to say, a lot of people say, well, the Bible is a collection of fairy tales and myths, and it has no bearing on history whatsoever. I'm actually quite surprised that this is still a common claim, because not only is the Bible a very good historical record, in many ways, it's kind of the gold standard. Most of the time, archaeology is catching up to things the Bible has said just for thousands of years. Take, for example, in Daniel, the book of Daniel, chapter 5, there's a record of a king called Belshazzar. He's the final king of Babylon. And for centuries, historians have said, the Bible, this is just myth-making of the Bible. We have no historical record of Belshazzar. The Bible made him up. There's no proof. Then they found proof. They found the name of King Belshazzar in what's called the Nabonidus Chronicle. And so archaeology just caught up to the Bible. The Bible had been saying this for 2,500 years. Another example is the Hittites. The Bible talks about a race of people called the Hittites. And again, historians said we have no record of the Hittites. The Bible just made these guys up. That's until they found evidence of the Hittites. They found a tablet, and on it, it referred to people making a trade from the land of Hatti. And then they said, well, this is confirming that these Hittite people existed. In fact, if you just really want to get into the quick nuts and bolts of it, in the Old Testament, we have 70 figures who also we have a corroboration for in archaeology. And in the New Testament, we have 32. And again, there's so many historical events that are recorded in the Bible that again are corroborated in other archaeological history. So I don't like to use the phrase that archaeology backs up the Bible. Because for me, the Bible's always making these claims, and it's always archaeology that is playing catch up. The Bible just continues to prove itself over and over again as a reliable historical document. And this is what, in many ways, makes it unique from other religious texts. A lot of other religious texts, both ancient and modern, are more in mythology. They're not trying to tell you what really happened, they're just telling stories. But the Bible makes a different claim. It says, we are telling real history with real people, real events, and the more we learn about history, the more we're realizing, yeah, the Bible is a very good source for history. So this myth also busted that it is inaccurate. Let's go to our final myth. Myth number 5. The Bible was not written by eyewitnesses and is therefore unreliable. I want to give just 2 really quick examples for why we can know that the majority of the Bible was written by eyewitnesses. The first is we have an incredible amount of details that only eyewitnesses would have been familiar with. The Dr. John Blomberg, he says that in the Gospel of John alone, we have 59 details that only an eyewitness would be familiar with. I'm not going to take the time to go through all these examples, but if you're interested, I'm happy to give at least 1 or 2 that are kind of my favorite details. The second, though, is a historical test that we can apply to any historical document or claim. This is called the criterion of embarrassment. Now, basically, what this means is the more embarrassing a story is, the more likely it is to be true. That makes sense, right? No one wants to make up, say, an embarrassing story about themselves. They want to make up good stories. So the more embarrassing it is, the more historically reliable. Let me give you an example. When I was in grade 5, the very first day of school, we were playing this game. I don't know if this game is still played, but everyone got in a circle, and in the circle you have one person in the middle. And the person in the middle has a ball, they throw the ball in the air, and as they throw the ball, they call out the name of someone in the circle. Now, if your name got called out, you have to go and catch the ball. But if your name wasn't called out, you want to run away as quickly as possible. As soon as that person catches the ball, they say stop, and everyone has to freeze. Then the guy with the ball, he rolls the ball, and if it hits you, you're out of the game. And then you just rinse, repeat until there's just like 2 guys left. Now, I had a genius strategy. This is year 5 me, right? So don't hold this against me too much. I thought, you know what? I'm wasting precious seconds by turning around to run away from the guy. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to run backwards from the circle. I'm already facing this way, so I'm just going to run backwards. And so I launched this strategy. I started running backwards, and as I'm running back, I trip over my shoes, land on my wrist just back like this, and I'm in a lot of pain. For the rest of the day, I'm just complaining to people. My wrists are killing me. And the teacher said, stop being a wuss, Christopher, you'll be fine. I said, no, like it's really bad. Christopher, look, you had a fall, relax. And I said, miss, I can't even pick up my pencil. She goes, Christopher, just stop. Mum comes to pick me up from home. As soon as I get in the car, I just start bawling my eyes, crying. And Mum goes, well, what on earth is going on? And I said, Mum, all day my wrist's been hurting. It's been period 1. I did something. And she goes, I'm taking you to the hospital. Turns out I had broken my scaphoid bone in my right hand and bruised it in the other. And it meant I had to wear 2 casts on my arms at the same time. Not a very fashionable look. Now, this is where I started thinking. I knew people were going to ask me, Christopher, how on earth did you get 2 casts on your hands? And I thought, I got a great story. Because I don't like the story of how it actually happened. The one where it actually happened is I just was dopey and tripped over my shoes, right? So I thought, look, everyone knows I live in a little suburb, and at the top of my street there's this school, and it's known to be a bit of a rough and tough school. And so I thought, maybe what I'll do is I'll say I got off the bus, I was at the school, at this dodgy school, not the one I went to, and I said, I saw these bullies picking on a guy, you know, and I just thought, I can't let this stand. And I got in the middle of those guys and I pushed them away. I said, you can't do this, you got to get out of here. And one of the bullies pushed me on the ground and I fell down. And gee, that's how I got 2 casts on my arm. And I thought this will be a really good story to tell people about how this happened. Now I want you to tell me, if I came to you and I told you the story I like, and then someone came to you and said, Christopher just tripped over his shoes, which are you more likely to believe? The shoe one, right? Not the one I make up, because that one makes me look really, really good. The more true story is the one with the embarrassing details. I'm not going to make up a story where I just look clumsy. I want to make up a story where I look like the hero. This is the test that is applied to any historical claims or documents. And when we look at in particular, the Gospels in the New Testament, they are full of embarrassing details that if you were trying to found a new religion, a new movement, you would not include it. Here's just a few examples. The disciples, they rarely understand the teachings of Jesus in the Gospels. And Jesus constantly has to tell them, oh, how do you still not get it? Now, if you're one of the disciples trying to found this new Jesus religion, would you write, yeah, half the time I didn't understand what the guy was saying? That's an embarrassing detail. The disciples constantly fought over who would be the greatest among them. The disciples were repeatedly rebuked by Jesus for their behavior. So many times Jesus had to call them out. One time, he goes to the Apostle Peter and says, get behind me, Satan. Now, he's not calling him Satan, but he's saying, Peter, right now, Satan is using you to say these stupid things that you're trying to tempt me with. The disciples abandoned Jesus when he was arrested. This was Jesus' lowest moment, and not one of his disciples stuck with it. One disciple betrayed Jesus to death, and another denied ever having known him. And finally, when the disciples didn't believe that Jesus had risen from the dead, despite the fact that they had multiple testimonies from multiple people telling them that he had, and besides the fact that Jesus had told them multiple times, I'm going to die and I'm going to rise again. And every time in the Gospels it says that, it says the disciples were either scared, they were afraid, they didn't understand, they didn't want to ask Jesus about it. Jesus warned them so many times, and even when they had testimony, he's risen from the dead, they said, nah, I don't believe it. There's no way that could be the case. These embarrassing details show these are accurate historical eyewitness accounts. If you were trying to make up a really convincing religion about this new Jesus thing, you would not include these details in your religious documents and texts. So that's our final myth that we have busted tonight. And now I want to ask, where does all of this information leave us? As I said, we've taken a detour tonight, not to look at evidence for God, but looking at, is the Bible a trustworthy and reliable document? Here's what we can know about the Bible from what we studied today. It has been accurately copied and preserved. In fact, it's the most well-preserved ancient document in history. We know its canonization came from an organic, not an arbitrary process. It is translated from the original languages, not a translation of a translation. We've seen it's historically reliable and was written by eyewitnesses of the actual events. And so now, hopefully, I hope I've been able to maybe bust a few myths that maybe you had in your mind and were thinking, the Bible seems a bit sketchy, I don't know about this. I hope I've been able to at least open up your mind a bit more to see that the Bible really is a trustworthy and reliable document. But now, here's the question. If the Bible is a trustworthy and reliable document, what can it tell us about God? Because that's the central claim it's making. It tells us a lot about history. It has lots of beautiful poetry and wisdom and stories in it. But at the end of the day, it's a document saying, I can tell you about God. That's the question I want to leave with you tonight. If the Bible is at the very least a trustworthy and reliable document, what else could it have for you? What could it be telling you about God? In the next two presentations that we're looking at tomorrow morning and tomorrow afternoon, This is the question that we are going to answer together. We're going to get deep into what the Bible actually says, and we're going to see that there is even more evidence to be discovered for the existence of God when we look into the Bible. Can I make this just small appeal to you tonight? If you have been through our sessions so far, if you've been to 1, 2, and 3, if you're just here for the first time tonight, you've enjoyed it, I just want to implore you, sessions 4 and 5 are where the rubber really meets the road. This is where we're going to get to, as I said, that question at the beginning. Not only what's God like out there, but what does it mean for God to be right here in my day-to-day life? Session 4 and 5 is really where it's all at. And it might sound a bit brutal, but it's true. You can come to sessions 1, 2, and 3, but if you don't come to 4 and 5, it'll be a fruitless endeavor. If you want to see this through to the end and want it to be a worthwhile interest and investment of your time, please make sure to come to sessions 4 and 5 tomorrow as we finish up our program of Is There Evidence for God? Thank you so much again for your time tonight, and I'm looking forward to hearing your questions.
Thank you very much for sharing with us, Christopher. I'd like to open up to you guys now. If you have any questions that you would like Chris to answer for you, you could ask them again.
Talking a bunch tonight, Tom.
What was a couple of the examples of the 59 items?
59. Let me give you one. It's better shown visually, but I'll quickly explain it. There's a passage in John where it talks about Jesus traveling, and it says he goes from, I think it's the region of Sidon down to the Decapolis. And if you look at it says on the way he makes a stop. Now, if you have a look on a map on where Jesus stops on the way to get to the Decapolis, it makes no sense. Literally, the route goes all the way around like this. And you think, Jesus, if Sidon is here, the Decapolis is here, just do a straight line from here to here, right? Why go all the way around and get to the other side here? On the surface, it actually looks like evidence against an eyewitness detail because it looks like the person didn't know the geography, they didn't know the maps, they didn't know where the cities were situated. But if you look at a topographical map, in between those two locations, there's an enormous mountain range. So really, it's actually an evidence for this person went on the journey with Jesus. If it was someone making it up, they probably would say, he went from here to here, not knowing there's this huge mountain range in the middle that would just make it impossible to travel. Instead, the eyewitness author says they went around, they visited this town, then they came around, demonstrating they at the very least knew the geography, the topography, and where these cities were all situated. So that's one of my favorite ones, but it looks better when I can show you the actual map on the screen. So I'm happy to show that afterwards. Think about another question here.
I've heard there's something called the Dead Sea Scrolls.
Yes.
Yeah, can you comment on that? What is that, some kind of old manuscript or some kind of biblical documents or anything?
Yes, so the Dead Sea Scrolls, we didn't discuss them tonight. Our primary focus tonight was on New Testament documents. But the Dead Sea Scrolls are a collection of Old Testament writings. So previous to that, previous to the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, our earliest copies of the Old Testament were quite far away from the original copies. But the Dead Sea Scrolls were written, believed to be written, I believe, around the 300s BC. I could be corrected on that. But it's a very, very early copy of the Old Testament. And what they found by analyzing the manuscripts in these old copies with our Old Testament today is they're very close to identical. Probably the best preserved of those documents is the book of Isaiah. You can go to Jerusalem today. They've got it in this beautiful museum, and they've got the whole scroll wrapped around this kind of circular shaped room. And you can read pretty much the entirety of the book of Isaiah preserved in this document found in the Dead Sea Scrolls. And when you compare Isaiah from that period to what we have today, the variants or changes that there are kind of like the ones we did in our example. Small spelling mistakes, little grammatical errors, nothing significant that affects doctrine or theology. So yeah, the Dead Sea Scrolls are another incredible example of how the Old Testament has also been preserved, just like the New Testament. So yeah. Yes.
A similar one. Could you comment on like the King James version and how that differed from before the King James version?
Yes. So when we come to the topic of translations of the Bible, it's important to know that the Christian church has never officially said this is like the translation, right? Because ultimately, what is going to be your best representation of what Jesus or Isaiah or Daniel said will be your original documents. So just a little quick backstory before the King James. The most used version of the Bible in the Christian church was called the Latin Vulgate. This Latin Vulgate was written by a Christian called Jerome in about the 400s AD, and pretty much for over 1,000 years that was the most commonly used. The King James was initiated by King James, and it's a very good translation. Today it's a little bit more difficult to read because it's in older English. And similar to the Latin Vulgate, for a long time the King James also became a bit of a standard text in English-speaking countries. So the King James Version, it's not really too much exciting to it. It's a historic, very significant document. I want to devalue its historical significance. But in the grand scheme of things, it is one of many very good and reliable English translations that we have. And a top tip, this is coming from a pastor, this is pastor tip now. When reading the Bible, and you're thinking, oh man, which translation should I use? Just use multiple. You've got multiple, right? So you'll find some get a little bit more of a nuance that maybe you would miss in another one. So that's what I prefer to do as well. I read one, read another, compare it, and get to my understanding. So we are blessed with just a plethora of good resources when it comes to the Bible. I think so, yes.
Yeah, in regards to the numbers of manuscripts that we have for the early texts, what time frame are those numbers coming from?
Yes, so the earliest is from the 100s. To get that would be from the 100s to 200s AD. To get the other manuscripts, you were getting into very big different types of, it'd be a very wide range of numbers. The exact kind of time frame that those 5,600 are in, I have to double check for you. But in order to be considered ancient, it would have to be relatively close, at least for the biblical documents. It's important to know as well, not all of the manuscripts we have are full copies of a book. Many of them are portions of these texts. But again, when you have over, 24,000 across 5 languages, you're dealing with an abundance of text. So the exact kind of time frame range, I'll double check and have a look for you.
Does anyone else have any questions?
What about the books of Maccabees? First and Second Maccabees.
First and Second Maccabees. So First and Second Maccabees are what I refer to, they're called apocryphal books. These are written in what is referred to as the intertestamental period. Basically, that means the period of time between the close of the Old and the beginning of the New Testament. And remember, I mentioned that the historian Josephus says, by the time of the 400s, the Jews had decided, these are our books we consider authoritative, and anything that comes after, they rejected. And a main reason they rejected it was they believed that God had stopped speaking through prophets after the last prophet Malachi. So anyone who wrote after Malachi, they said, look, it can be a good book, it can be a historically interesting book, but it won't be inspired. So the Christians, similarly, they just did the same. They said, well, the Jews for the last 400 years, or 300 when it comes to Maccabees, the last 300 years, they haven't considered First and Second Maccabees as an authoritative book, and so we'll do the same. We're just going to kind of defer to, the Jewish canon in our case. So You'll also find in the 1st and 2nd Maccabees there are a few historical errors, a few kind of dodgy doctrinal things, so that would be extra evidence for why you wouldn't put it in the biblical canon, especially those theological questionable things it has inside of it. But still a very interesting book in terms of history and telling us about those events that it records.
Any final questions?
That looks to be it.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Christopher, for sharing with us this evening. Would you like to close?
Yeah, of course. I'm in special prayer. Dear God, I just want to thank you so much for this time. We can look at this history and archaeology, look at the Bible together. God, I just pray that if any wisdom has come out of my mouth tonight, I actually give you praise and glory for it. And Lord, I ask you, please give us safe travels as we go home, and please keep us in good health until we see each other again. I pray in Jesus' name. Amen.
Thank you all for coming. If you enjoyed the talk this evening, we will be having another one at 10 a.m. Tomorrow morning, but it will be on the other side of campus in the social sciences building. And that's something that you can type into Google Maps or something like that. That should take you to the right location, and we will have people welcoming and directing you if you come that way as well. So that's tomorrow at 10 a.m. Our second talk is 2 p.m.
2 p.m. And actually, let me give a quick, I didn't plug the topics. The next 2 topics, we're looking at evidence from prophecy in the morning. So prophecy is a kind of biblical word for a prediction of the future or future events. And the 5th and the final is evidence from the resurrection. It's the central claim of the Christian faith, right? That Jesus rose from the dead. If Jesus didn't rise from the dead, there's no point in me being here talking to you about any of this, right? So that's what I mean by these are really the topics to study. 4 and 5, evidence from prophecy, from the Bible, and evidence from the resurrection. So those are our topics for tomorrow.
Yes, thank you very much. As ASOC and the other club events, our usual Saturday 10 a.m. meetings are in ES 204, which is the one across the hallway, all with the exception of tomorrow. We also have a small group Bible study and a free meal that meets at 6 p.m. on Friday nights as well, also in ES 204. So if that's something that you think you would be interested in, or would even like to try out, just to come along and to hear the messages, or to just kind of find a little community, we'd love to invite you along to those as well. So I want to thank you for all coming this evening and joining us for this talk. If you would like to stay behind, we will have some juice and stuff for you guys as well. So feel free to get up, to talk to someone new, to meet some new friends. Thank you for coming.